Hello, welcome to episode 26 of My Week at the Club. This is Roger Capello bringing my exploits at the Wachusett Chess Club in Fitchburg, Mass, where I play every week in a tournament game. And this week I had a game against Jim Hankard, who's in the upper right corner there of the screen. But before I launch into that, I want to do, oops, it would probably help if I had the microphone where you could hear it better. Hopefully this will be a little louder. As I was saying, I played Jim Hankard this week. But before I launch into that game, I wanted to give a brief explanation of this picture of the sun here in the center. So this is an SDO satellite picture of the sun. Gorgeous pictures that they've taken in various wavelengths. And there's a fascinating feature of the sun, a characteristic that I just learned about a few years ago, and it astounded me that I hadn't realized it before. And I wanted to share it with you. And it has to do with the fusion that goes on in the sun's core. And the center of the sun, of course, is quite an unusual environment. Something like 15 million degrees centigrade temperature, and the density of the gas there is about 150 times as dense as water. So it's a pretty compacted, hot place where the fusion is taking place. And it's often been said that in the fusion reactors that people are trying to construct on the Earth, that they're trying to recreate the conditions in the center of the sun. Well, that's not quite true, because they're trying to get a gigawatt out of a small, relatively small tokamak reactor. And the energy production of the sun actually is quite different. It turns out that in a cubic meter, right? It doesn't fit quite in the screen here, but a cubic meter of material in the center of the sun, the fusion is that reaction that's undergoing, converting largely hydrogen to helium, is producing a grand total of 265 watts. So, that's a quarter of a kilowatt. Very low. In fact, that's about the same energy production as a cubic meter of a compost pile. That's how fast energy is being released in the center of the sun. And so it's nothing like a tokamak reactor in that regard. And the only reason that we get so much energy from the sun is that the core actually is quite large. A core is about the inner quarter or so of the sun's diameter or radius. And since the sun is quite large, even a quarter of it has a significant volume. And within that volume, then there's a lot of energy that's being produced, a lot of cubic meters. But in each cubic meter, it's actually a very leisurely rate at which that fusion reaction is taking place. And so the conditions really aren't quite the same as what's going on inside a tokamak. Okay, off to the chess. So this week, as I said, I played Jim Hankard. I was fortunate enough to have white. It was the first round of the, the Rocco Pasquale Memorial. And, I'm sorry, Reggie Boone Memorial. Says it right there on my screen. Okay, Reggie Boone this month. Sorry, Reg. And I opened with d4. Okay, Jim replied g6, which is hinting that he wants to go into some sort of Indian defense, a modern, a Pirtz, King's Indian defense, something on that order. Benoni, Grunfeld, everything's on the table at this point. I continued with c4. He played bishop g7, so this is still a modern defense move order, but it could transpose into those other possibilities. I played knight c3. So far, nothing's ruled out. And now he played c5, which kind of gives it a unique flavor. And I didn't know it at the time, but I looked it up afterward, and this thing is a branch of the modern defense called the pterodactyl. I say P? Pterodactyl variation. And I'm not quite sure how it got that name. I doubt that it's been around all that long. But after c5, which immediately challenges my d-pawn, white has some options. I could play my knight to f3, which would allow me to get into a Sicilian sort of position, possibly with a Marazzi bind with my c and e pawns on the fourth rank. That struck my mind. Some players I've seen would play e3 in this position just to support that pawn and to keep the pawn duo strong. I chose neither of those. And what I did was to push the pawn to d5, which gives it more of a Benoni flavor. Jim restrained it from going any further with d6. Now instead, at this point, he could have played the queen out to a5, but that would be nothing too worrisome. I mean, sure my knight's attacked twice, but after I play bishop to d2, now it's me who has the threat, threatening to move the knight somewhere with a discovered attack. And bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop would be a mistake because it would be forking his queen and rook. So that wouldn't be too good of a line for Jim to go down. So instead he just played d6, restraining my pawns. I went ahead and pushed my e-pawn. In the Benoni, it often goes to e4. Sometimes people like to play it to e3, but I was feeling suitably aggressive. It wasn't even under pressure by his knight yet. His knight hasn't developed. In fact, the one thing I have to watch out for is our tricks involving this bishop. At any point here, he could do something such as attacking or trading it off for the knight and giving me doubled c-pawns, but I would have been happy with that because that gives me the advantage of the weak dark square complex around his king, well, assuming that he castles over there, and at the cost of these doubled pawns. So he did not do that. He played a6, so threatening to expand on the center with b5 would probably be indicated now or sometime soon after bishop d7. So I made a Benoni-like response to that a4, which really discourages that option. And then he offered to close the position with e5, and this surprised me a little. I was expecting him to go to e6 instead and go down really the lines of a Benoni. And instead, with this closed position, I mean, I have the option of taking on e6, but that didn't appeal to me. He could take back either with the bishop, which would allow my knight to use his d5 square, or more likely take back with the pawn, which would then keep me out of d5. I didn't like those possibilities, and so I sat for quite a while trying to figure out what would be a good setup of my pieces in order to meet this center that he's erected. And what I decided was to play my knight to e2 and play f4. But if I'm going to do that, then my bishop has to go somewhere. You know, either I fianchetto perhaps, or do what I actually did, which was to play it to bishop d3, which looks a little funny because it's stuck behind its own pawns. But the idea is to follow up now with knight g to e2, and then castling an f4 and expanding on the king side. So that was just the setup that I chose. He did nothing to restrict that. He just played knight to d7. And as I mentioned there in my notes, at this point, instead of playing my knight to e2, what Stockfish really wanted me to do in this position was to play h5. And that, you know, keeps the, it has a cramping influence on black's queen side. It keeps the pawn restricted, and at some point this knight might play to a4 and into b6. And, you know, I've seen Magnus Carlsen, for example, winning several games in the recent Blitz and Rapid Play championships with this kind of pawn structure. He pushes the a pawn to the 5th rank and restricts the black's pawns, or he did it as black as well, in which case he restricted white's pawns with the same kind of space-grabbing move. I did not choose to do that, though. I was a little afraid that pawn would go weak. And I played my knight to e2. Okay, he played h6. That was quite a surprise for me. I'm still not sure of the purpose of that move. The only thing I could think about at the time was that he was just preparing g5 and wanted to thwart my plan of pushing my pawn to f4. But that was okay with me, because if he plays his pawn to g5, then he'll have created weaknesses on, oops, not on that square. Can I undo it? No. Okay, well, just on these two squares, on h5 and f5, that my knight can exploit. So that happens in a couple moves, actually. I castled. He developed his knight through e7. I should have mentioned before that one bad thing about setting up the pawn structure that he did in the center is this bishop on g7 has really been restricted in its mobility. It's biting on its own pawn granite. So I would like to keep that bishop locked in as much as possible. Okay, at this point now, let me go back one move. So at this point, I was thinking about playing f4 immediately. But the problem with playing f4 immediately is that then that allows him to go ahead and capture. I could recapture with either the bishop or the knight. Doesn't much matter. Say I did it with the bishop to develop it. And that would allow him then to play his knight into e5. And so it gives a very nice post for the knight, and it also allows that bishop to get released along that long diagonal. And so I really didn't want to go in for this move. So that's why instead I played bishop to e3, deciding to prepare a bit more before I open things up on the king side. And that gave him a chance actually then to play g5, which I was happy with, because as I said, I felt that was creating more weaknesses than it was helping him. And so that allowed me to then play knight to g3. I think Stockfish, if we go back here, for example, in this position, it was thinking that, with a plan starting with f5 for black, that I had a little less than a pawn advantage. But then after he played g5, I'm up to a pawn and a half already. Again, it's asking me to play a5, but it also, at some point, suggests the idea with knight to g3. In fact, it's not too unhappy after knight to g3. It sees that also as about a pawn and a half advantage. So let's turn that off. Okay, so now my knight has these squares to use. And he played his knight to f6 to discourage me from entering through h5, which is the square I wanted to enter. And I thought for quite a while trying to decide what to do with the knight. I would probably, at this point, have been better off making no knight move. I believe, again, that Stockfish is probably saying a5, a5. Yes, it's saying a5. It thinks I'm up to close to 2-pawn advantage, but it wants that a5 line. I did not do that. Instead, I have a hard time not playing actively. That's kind of a weakness that I have as a chess player. And so I really felt like I wanted to play the knight into either f5 or h5. And the two lines both had good and bad aspects about them. For example, in the notes, if I played to h5, what I was looking at was him castling, me trading off on f6. He would take back with the bishop. My queen could develop to h5. And then his king could go to f7. And what I didn't realize in this line was that then h4 would be a very strong follow-up. I didn't look quite far enough. Of course, it turns out that this is not best play for black, and that after knight to h5, that best thing for him is just to trade the knights off at this point, and not to allow me to discombobulate his kingside by capturing on f6. So it turns out that the best play line with the knight going to h5 is just about the same as the best play line with the knight going into f5. They both have the same advantage, and it's wasted a little bit of my lead, but I'm still about a pawn ahead, as you can see. Okay, so with my knight on f5, he traded off immediately. He could have taken it with the knight. I think he did it this way because he wanted to put pressure on that pawn. on my f pawn. But the thing is that, okay, so he puts pressure on with the queen. So now he's attacking it knight and queen, and I could defend it by coming out with my queen to f3, but that has the problem that he could then drive my queen away by pushing his g pawn. So that didn't appeal to me. Instead, I defended it on c2. And looking at this position, this is actually quite nice for white because the pawn here, even though it looks like it could be a weakness, it has a real cramping influence on black's game. And in particular, the queen has a hard time, queen and knight both. Both of these pieces over here, the queen and the knight, have their mobility really restricted by my pawn sitting on f5. The knight can't use this g6 square. The queen can't get over to the king side where I think he would like to be. Let's see, bring the board back. Okay, and this pawn, it's very hard for him to attack it a third time. He doesn't have a white squared bishop. He can't get a rook to it. This knight could attack it a third time, but it takes 3 moves to get to the square from the square adjacent to it. So assuming that you're on an empty board, it might take even more if there are pieces in the way. So it's very hard for him to do anything about that cramping pawn. And if I really, really had to, at some point I could even defend it with pawns. So I was happy at this point. Okay, Jim played his queen out to h5. That surprised me. I sort of expected him to play queen to g4 instead. Or queen. Knight, that thing's a knight. That thing that looked like a horse. I expected him to play his knight to g4, attacking my bishop. But, I can just retreat it and then drive the knight away with my next move with h3. So that's presumably why he didn't do that. And then instead he played his knight out after get going here. Oh, wrong move. Okay, after queen to c2, he played his knight out to h5. But the problem with this move is that I can simply play g3, and then that just totally restricts the mobility of his knight. It's true I've created some light squared weaknesses, but he doesn't have a light squared pawn, so that's not so big of a deal. Doesn't have a light squared bishop, so it's not such a big deal. And it would take a while for him to redeploy his knights to actually usefully hop around in on my light squares. In the meantime, with this pawn controlling f4, this knight on h5 is out of play. And so he embarked upon kind of a strange maneuver here with bishop to f6. And the idea here is that he wants to go ahead and attack my pawn a third time, as I was talking about. Oops, I'm really having trouble with these large cursors. There you go. With the knight on g7, attacking the pawn a third time, making me push a pawn or something to defend it. But his pieces are not well coordinated. His minor pieces are not well coordinated on the king side. In particular, after knight goes to g7, then that bishop becomes undefended. So I played what looked to me like a kind of an obvious move, which was playing the knight into e4. Only after I played this, and he thought for a long time, because he didn't want to give up on the idea of attacking my weak f-pawn. And there are various, looks, there are ways for someone to go wrong here. This pawn is attacked twice, and it's not even defended at all right now. But it turns out that it would be very bad for, well, there's no way, if the knight were to take the pawn, then I could play knight takes bishop check and win his queen, among other things. If the queen were to take the pawn, I could play knight takes, see if I can get the arrow to go to the right place. Knight takes the d pawn check and fork the king and queen. I mean, there's no way to take this pawn safely. And given that he can't take the pawn, if he instead came back and attacked it for a third time with the knight, this bishop falls and the king and queen are forked by knight takes f6. So there are only ways to go wrong here. And in fact, he's almost in danger of me winning with a pawn fork immediately. So when he goes back here, it looks like I can almost play f6. Of course, he has that square hit twice with the knight and the bishop. So I can't quite win a piece by playing f6. But what I can do is try to go back to the position that I spied after I played knight e4. So as I mentioned, went back 2 moves ago, right? Okay, in this position, I played knight e4. Instead of playing knight e4, I realized only after I did it, and Jim was thinking, that what I should have done was to play queen to e2. And the beauty of that, the computer actually says queen d1, but it's basically the same idea. The beauty of queen e2 is now it attacks his undefended knight. There's no way to defend that knight, no safe square to put it on other than g7. And after he goes to g7, then when my knight comes into e4, there's no way to defend that bishop other than playing his other knight to g8, which is an incredibly cramped passive position. And I would have loved playing this position. I think this is probably 3-pawn advantage or something positionally. 2.8, so 2.5 to 3-pawn advantage, something on that order. So it looks very nice for white if I'd only thought to do that. And so instead, I played knight to e4. Wait a second. Let's get back to the real position here. Okay. I played knight to e4. He realized his mistake, dropped his bishop back. I dropped my knight back to where it was, hoping that that he would take this as a tacit draw offer and maybe play his knight back to f6, in which case I could go down that line I was just looking at. But, play his bishop to f6, in which case I could go down that line. Repeating moves. But he didn't play his bishop to f6, instead played his knight back to f6. And now with the knight on f6, I realize I'm kind of a dark shadow here with the sun shining. It's a day where the sun's going in and out of behind the clouds, playing peekaboo. So it's hard to get the lighting conditions right. Okay, so now that the knight went back there, what I did, instead of playing the knight to e4, since I didn't like that line too well, was to make a forcing move, which I really shouldn't have made. Black is in a really cramped position here. It's very hard for any of Black's pieces to profitably move. And about all he can do is to make useful moves with his rook. He could castle, but if he castles either way, but at this point I was still thinking he would castle kingside, then he would have a fixed target over there, and I would feel better about opening up the game going after the king. At least it forces him to commit himself to having an address for his king that I could go after. And, I could have played this rook, centralized the rook to the e file. I could have gotten my king off of the g file before I open up the g line, which would have been a useful move to make. A couple of useful moves. The computer likes the idea of not even going for the plan of opening up the f file, but instead playing the rook over to b1 and pushing the b pawn and opening up the queen side, because Black is so cramped that white can maneuver back and forth and attack wherever the weaknesses are. Unfortunately, I didn't do that. Instead, what I did was to sort of impetuously open the game up immediately, which is a weakness in my game that I've commented on before, and I'm still struggling with the right time to play actively in my games. So when I did this, Jim made the correct response, which is to trade off the g-pawns, and then he attacked my loose bishop with his knight. I retreated it to d2 and thought I was doing okay at this point. I am doing okay, but I've given up much of my advantage. He then took the f-pawn, And now at this point, if I ask Stockfish to analyze it, I'm down to a few tenths of a, 3 or 4 tenths of a pawn advantage, maybe half a pawn maximum. And as you can see, it's asking for bishop takes f4, which is what I did. During the game, I thought quite a while about taking an f4 with the rook, because, you know, ideally, after I took with the rook, his knight would have to fall back, and then all of a sudden my rook has become very active, and you know, it was very, in fact, if it does, his knight would actually have to fall back to f6 because to blockade this pawn. Otherwise, I could simply play pawn to f6 and fork his 2 pieces. But unfortunately, there's a Zwischenzug here. He doesn't have to move that knight. Instead, he could, well, there's actually a couple Zwischenzugs. There's the one I thought, well, there's several moves he could make. He could check with the bishop. He could attack my rook with the bishop, and he could make the move that the computer actually saw, which I didn't see, was to play an immediate rook to g8, and that's best of all. But all the lines are a little similar. So with the rook to g8, all of a sudden he's threatening to unleash mayhem along the g file, and if I were so, and I have to get my king off that file because I was so silly as to take the knight, then with the bishop check. Now the rook is attacked and it's pinned, so I can't unfortunately play rook takes bishop, and he's going to win the rook for the knight. So he's winning serious material here, and if he doesn't, if I don't, in this position, if I don't play rook takes knight, but instead play king to h1, he could still attack my rook. And now, after my rook moves, there's an attack on this f2 square, and he can't defend it. I mean, he can't drop the rook back to defend it because the knight is attacking f2. It's a Pandora's box, and actually, I think this position is a little bit in black's favor even. Yeah, a few tenths of a pawn in black's favor. So that would have been a serious mistake. I did not do that. I played bishop takes f4. That does allow him to play this check. And let's scroll this up a little bit so you can see what the game score as we go along. So he checks me. It forces my king to the corner and then gives him time to castle queenside. The only problem with that is that although his king is safer there than it is in the center of the board, it still is not totally safe on that c8 square. And that's the basis for some upcoming tactics. What I wanted to do was to somehow get my pawn on f5 out of the way and get rid of his knight on e7 and play bishop to f5 with a pin of the queen. But there were various sacrificial ideas. I couldn't make any of them work, and neither can Stockfish, so I don't feel too badly. So instead I decided, okay, I will develop some more. I occupy this open file. And it encouraged him to counter with his rook on that file, which turns out is a bit of a mistake, and he really should have played the king to b8, even though this is a very natural-looking move to defend that knight. Because now what that allows is my knight to make that entry on e4 that it was threatening to make before. And it's got a threat that's very hard to meet here on the d6 square. Both the knight and the bishop are attacking that square. And it's only defended by the queen. He can't get any piece other than the bishop to defend it, or he could block with a knight on that square. And it turns out that either bishop to knight 5 or knight to e5, sorry, bishop to e5 or knight to e5 are both not good. The best move here is to play knight takes pawn, but there are a lot of technical complications I won't go into, but which strongly favor white if he were to do that. So instead what he did was to make a fairly natural looking move, which was to block with the bishop. The problem, of course, is that I can just trade that off, and regardless of how he recaptures. So he recaptured with a pawn, and that's going to allow me to capture this weak c-pawn over here with an attack on the queen. If he had captured the other way with the knight, that would be horrible, because then I have a, well, actually they're both probably equally bad. I'm not sure which one is worse, but I have knight into, after, did I show this? Actually, it's not as bad. If he had taken with the knight, then I can come into f6, forking the rook and the queen, and I win the exchange. But that ends up being about 2 points, a little less than 2 pawns in my favor, whereas taking back the way he did with the pawn, with the d pawn, actually ended up about +6 in white's advantage. So the d pawn, the problem with this is it really allows me to attack the queen, push it around, and at the same time just get my pieces all swarming in the area where his king is. He moved the queen to c7. There are not a lot of good moves here, since obviously it was +6. I chose to defend the knight instead of dropping it back immediately to e4. They both looked like tempting options, but this was a good option. I wanted to get my pawns rolling to tear down the pawns in front of his king. He dropped back with his knight for defensive purposes. That was a decent move. I played queen c3, which after I made it, I was wishing I hadn't, because the idea here, the reason I did it was to, put a second attack on this pawn, and it's just defended now by his queen. So I'm threatening to win the pawn. The thing I don't like about it is the queen is undefended on the square, and I started to see visions of combinations with, knight takes pawn, pawn takes, knight takes, that sort of thing going on. But and probably with b6 to drive my knight away. It turns out they don't work, but when you're well ahead in the game, you don't want to do anything that makes the game more complex and opens up a lot of counterplay for the opponent. So that was why I wasn't happy with this move. He played knight to g4 to defend the pawn. I dropped back, as I said 2 moves ago. I was thinking about playing this knight back to e4 because, of course, I'm threatening to push this e-pawn now, forking the knight and the queen. Something really needs to be done about that, but actually he did not do anything about that. Instead, here he made a worse move. So, if you look at Stockfish, it wanted a line like knight takes d5, pawn takes, queen, knight takes queen. And now so he's only lost a piece here, and it loses more slowly, as I said in my notes, but white's clearly winning in this case. So instead he played f6, which just throws some gasoline on the fire. That allows me to go ahead and fork the 2 pieces. The queen moved. Then I took time out to attack the queen again with b5, because the queen doesn't have many good squares to go to. He traded off the a-pawn for my a-pawn, and then dropped back to d7. I thought about, things like knight c5, but of course then this pawn is undefended. And so I decided I better just cash in on my extra material right away. So I went ahead and took the knight. And we're getting near the end of the game here. He took back with the rook, and that allowed me then to play a very strong move of a rook to a1, now threatening to come in on a8 with check, and winning this rook over here if he does nothing about it. I sort of expected him to play king b8 at this point, but this is not such a great move. My plan was to sort of the main variation that I was looking at was to put that cramping pawn in, which is useful in these sorts of positions on g6. Well, it's not g6, but in this case it's b6. And if he drops back with a queen somewhere, this is not a good square to drop back to, but an illustrative variation. Then I can simply sack the rook, check, and he's forced to take it. This is kind of a standard combination. The queen comes out, check, and then uses that square that the pawn is now supporting to drive the king away. You check the king again. It has to come to the 7th rank, and then you capture that undefended pawn. King has to move up because both of the, in this case, the pawn and the pawn and the knight are covering these squares. You check again. Now that we're a little closer than we were on A8, the king moves up, and now it's checkmate on C7. So that was the kind of thing that could easily have happened if he played the king to B8. Instead, he played his rook to E8, and this allows a simple mate in 3. So I just play rook to A8 check. The king has to come up. I can play my queen up check, and now once again he can't use these squares because they're covered by the pawn and the knight, and the queen is covering this B6 square. Only legal move is B6, and now that's mate. So it was, I don't know, I always say it's a fun game when I win, but I think that's true for all of us. It's easier to appreciate those games sometimes. And last week against Rob King was sort of heartbreaking when I thought I had a much better position at one point and ended up losing it. But this one I was able to keep the advantage and see it through to the end. So I'll see you next week in round 2, and I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.